Hello students, my name is Dr. Ashutosh and welcome to another lecture video of biomechanics. And in this lecture, we are going to see the type of joints. So let's start today's lecture. First of all, let's understand what is a joint. So joint is a junction or a pivot point between two or more bones. In our body, whenever two or more bones combine at a certain point to facilitate a movement, that point or junction is actually called as a joint. Movement of the body as a whole occur primarily through the rotation of the bones. We all know that whenever there is a rotation of the movement occurs, and these rotation of the bones occur around the joints. We must also know what is a arthrology. Arthrology, as we can say by the name also, it suggests that arthro, which means joint, and logy means to study. So here we study the classification, structure, function of the joints. So this was all about the definition of joint. Now let's classify the joint. We classify the joints basically into three types based on their anatomical structure and movement potential. According to the movement potential, there can be three types of joint. First is the synarthrosis, second is amphiarthrosis, and the third is diarthrosis. The example of a synarthrosis joint is a joint of our teeth and the gum, which is also called as peg and socket joint. The example of amphiarthrosis joint, we see intervertebral disc. It is a sort of amphiarthrosis joint. Diarthrosis joint are the synovial joints like glenohumeral joint, hip joint, knee joint. These are the types of diarthrosis joint. Let's understand all these types of joint in detail. First of all, let's see what is a synarthrosis. To understand synarthrosis, we must know four things about synarthrosis. First thing is the joint material. How synarthrosis joint is made. It is made of dense irregular connective tissue. What is a dense irregular connective tissue? We'll be seeing it in our coming lecture videos in very detail. What is a dense irregular connective tissues and which type of materials are present in this dense irregular connective tissue. But for now, make sure you remember that synarthrosis is a joint which is made up of dense irregular connective tissue. Range of motion here is negligible. There is negligible range of motion available at synarthrosis joint, and the primary function of this joint is to bind the bone. It functions as a cement. So you use cement to join two bricks. In the same way, our body uses this type of joint, which is synarthrosis joint, to combine two bones. So it is used to bind the bones within a functional unit so that the bones combine and they function as a single unit in our body. Examples of the synarthrosis joint is the sutures of the skull sutures, the sutures between the skull bones, like between the parietal and the frontal, and the temporal bones, or between the occipital bones. These type of sutures are the type of synarthrosis joint. As I explained you earlier also, the teeth embedded in the socket is a type of synarthrosis joint, which is also called as a peg and socket joint. Distal tibiofibular joint present is also a type of synarthrosis joint. Coming on to the next type of joint, which is amphiarthrosis. Amphiarthrosis is made up of hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage. This was made up of dense irregular connective tissue, but amphiarthrosis is made up of hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage, which means there will be some sort of movement in this type of joint. We know that fibrocartilage and hyaline cartilage are known for their compressive ability, for their ability to provide the shock absorption. Available motion here is not much, but it is minimal to moderate, and the primary function of this joint is to restrain the movement, and as I told you earlier, to provide the shock absorption. These are the two primary functions of the amphiarthrosis joint. What were the two primary functions of synarthrosis joint? It was to combine the two bones so that they function as a single unit. Here, amphiarthrosis joint's primary function is to restrain the movement and provide shock absorption. Example of this type of joint is very well understood. It is intervertebral disc, which is present between the two vertebrae, and its sole purpose is for the shock absorption. Other is pubic symphysis joint, which is present between two pubic bones, and the manubriosternal joint present between the manubrium and the sternum are the examples of amphiarthrosis joint. In all these examples, there is little movement, but shock absorption capacity is also present in these types of joint. So remember, whenever we will talk about amphiarthrosis joint, you must be aware that minimal to moderate movement is present over here, and its primary function is to restrain the movement and provide the shock absorption. Moving on to the next type of joint, which is a very interesting joint, which is diarthrosis joint. We call them synovial joints also. In these type of joint, there is a true joint space. Means between the two articular bones there is a space, and that space is filled with the synovial fluid. We will see in the coming lectures what is the function of this synovial fluid. This synovial fluid is actually here to provide the nutrition and to lessen the friction. For now, let's understand the joint material of this diarthrosis joint is the two articulating surfaces of the bone filled with the synovial fluid, and the available motion is extensive. These are the type of joints which are known for their mobility. We know that how extensive movements are present in the shoulder joint, in the hip joint. So they are very mobile joint. We see usually 2 degrees, 3 degree movements in these type of joints. And the primary function is to provide the primary pivot points for the movement. They are meant for the movement. The other previous two joints were not meant for the movement, but this joint is meant for the movement. It allows a lot of mobility, and the examples are really extensive. It could be shoulder joint, it could be knee joint, it could be hip joint, it could be ankle joint, it could be wrist. A lot of examples are present in our body. So I hope this was clear to you that what are the types of joint based on their movement potential. There are 3 types: synarthrosis, amphiarthrosis and diarthrosis. We have studied about their joint material, their available motion, primary function, as well as we have already seen their examples in the body. Now let's understand a little more about this diarthrosis or synovial joint. As I told you earlier, there is a joint cavity between the two articulating surface which is filled by the synovial fluid. There are 7 elements that are always present with the synovial joint. Any synovial joint you take, these 7 things will present there for sure. So these are the 7 peculiar things that are available in synovial joints. So let's look at them one by one. First of all, there is synovial fluid. It is a synovial joint. The name itself is derived from this synovial fluid. The most peculiar feature is that in these types of joints, synovial fluid is present. But why is this synovial fluid? What is the function of this synovial fluid over here? So this synovial fluid here is meant for providing the nutrition to the articular cartilage, as well as it has the capability of making the joint's surface frictionless. So if the friction is less, the movement can occur very easily. It will cause the lesser erosion of the bones. So this synovial fluid is of very much importance for these joints. Second important thing is articular cartilage. We know articular cartilage is present at the ends of the articulating bones wherever they form the joint. As you can see in this example also, there are 2 articulating bones here. This is your femur and this is your tibia. Your femur, you can see this white portion, this is actually the articular cartilage. Over here also there is articular cartilage. Articular cartilage provides the function of shock absorption, which is of very crucial importance because there are many weight bearing synovial joints. So there is a lot of force which is given to these joints. It must be distributed properly and the shock should be absorbed for their proper functioning. So this function is actually done by the articular cartilage. The third thing that you must know is articular capsule. So this is the capsule which surrounds the whole joint. You can understand it better by just imagining that there is a layer of polythene which covers the whole joint. Every structure is enclosed within this articular capsule. So whenever there is a synovial joint, there would be a articular capsule. Fourth thing is synovial membrane. So this is the membrane which actually produces the synovial fluid. So it is also very important. It will be present in all the type of synovial joints. There are some ligaments. We know that ligaments provide the stability to the joint. These are the restraints, passive restraints to the joint. These will also be present at the synovial joint to provide the functioning of stability. Capsular, I give you some, let me give you example of this capsular ligaments. In the knee joint, if I talk about capsular ligaments, they can be MCL, they can be LCL, ACL. So these are the ligaments which provide the stability. Muscles also provide stability, but the ligament provide the passive restraints. Sixth thing which is present in the synovial joint is blood vessels. So blood vessel has to be present there because you need the circulation to go there, oxygen to go there, and the healing and repairing process to occur. So blood vessels will be there to do the healing process and to make the joint healthy in the case of an injury. Then there is sensory nerves which takes the sensation from the joint and gives it to the upper centers of the body. They are also present in synovial joint. So basically there are 7 things. First is synovial fluid, articular cartilage, articular capsule, synovial membrane, capsular ligament, blood vessels, and sensory nerves. Apart from these 7 elements, 4 elements are also seen in some special type of synovial joints. They have a peculiar function in this synovial joint. They are not present in every synovial joint, but whenever they are present, they serve an important function. So first of all, intra-articular disc or meniscus. So we see there is a disc in temporomandibular joint, there is a meniscus in knee joint, medial and lateral meniscus are present in knee joint. The primary function of these structures are to provide the shock absorption. They are made up of fibrocartilage. They function in providing the shock absorption or increasing the shock absorption capacity of the joint. Second structure which is present in some of the synovial joint is the labrum. You can very well see that labrum is present in the glenohumeral joint as well as at the hip joint between your acetabulum and your head of femur. In glenohumeral joint, the glenoid cavity is very less to accommodate the head of the humerus. So to deepen that cavity, labrum is present at the periphery of this articulating surface of glenoid as it deepens the glenoid cavity so that it can accommodate the head of humerus. So peripheral labrum is also of very importance as it increases the congruity as well as it deepens the structure so that the movement can occur very well at that joint. Apart from this, fat pad is present. So a function of fat pad is also to reduce the friction as well as to provide the shock absorption capacity to the joint. These are structures which are made up of adipose tissue and they are present to provide the shock absorption capacity as well as to reduce the friction. Then there is a synovial plica. This is the extra fold of the synovial present at the joint. So what is the function of this synovial plica? So whenever you do the movement and there is the separation of the articular surface, then the synovial membrane gets stretched. To prevent its overstretching, this synovium is actually folded at some points which gets extended when you do the separation of the articulating surface. So whenever you are doing the separation of the articulating surface, this synovial plica actually prevents the synovium in overextending. It prevents the synovium to overextend. This is the main function of the synovial plica. Apart from those 7 peculiar elements, these 4 elements were also seen in the synovial joints in some special joints. As you can see, fat pad is present in knee joint, labrum you can see in the glenoid cavity, intra-articular disc or meniscus is present in temporomandibular joint or knee joint, synovial plica is also present in knee joint. So these are the structures which are not present in every synovial joint but are present in some special types. Moving on, let's see another classification. In the earlier classification, we saw the classification according to the motion, the amount of movement present at the joint. In synarthrosis joint, there was a very little movement. In amphi, there was a mild to moderate movement, and in diarthrosis, there was extensive movement. But now let's understand the joint according to their mechanical analogy, because this is all about biomechanics. You have to understand the mechanics of the joint, how they are functioning. So we are dividing them into these seven types, and we will be looking each and every type in detail. First of all, let's understand the hinge joint. As you can see in this example also, whenever you open the door of your home, there is a hinge which is attached between the door and the structure which is present to accommodate that door. So this hinge, actually, there are three things which we must know about hinge joint. First is the primary movement. Primary movement in hinge joint. The example of the hinge joint is your humeroulnar joint or your elbow joint. Flexion and extension is also only present because it allows only uniplanar movement. Uniplanar movement is only allowed at a hinge joint, and it resembles mechanically with the door hinge. As you can see here in the diagram also, this is the hinge of the door. In the same way, this is your humeroulnar joint which is allowing uniplanar movement. Your door hinge also allows only one plane movement, and the same way it is also allowing one plane movement, which is flexion and extension occurring at sagittal plane. And this is the interphalangeal joint. Here flexion extension is also seen, like this is the flexion extension which is occurring at sagittal plane. So this was a hinge joint. Now second is a pivot joint. Pivot joint, there is a primary motion. So there is something which is pivot. You must have seen your fan in the ceiling at your home. It is pivoted at a point and it is rotating around it, the spinning around it. In the same way, one member is spinning around a single axis of rotation of the other member, like a door knob. So mechanical resemblance is the door knob. You have to rotate the door knob to open the door. In the same function, there is a rotation of a bone occurring around a single axis of the other bone. Its example is the atlantoaxial joint. Atlas, which is the first cervical vertebra, and axis, which is the second cervical vertebra. And in between those two movements, majority of the rotation of the cervical spine occurs. So you are doing the rotations like this, axial rotation. So this axial rotation is actually occurring at a pivot joint. Another example of this pivot joint where this spinning is occurring is the proximal radioulnar joint. This is the proximal radioulnar joint. So whenever you are doing supination or pronation, there is a spinning of one bone onto the another. This was all about pivot joint. Now let's understand the ellipsoid joint. In ellipsoid joint, there is only biplanar motion which is possible, and in that biplanar motion also there are only two type of motions which are possible. First is flexion and extension, and another movement is abduction and adduction. Mechanical resemblance of this ellipsoid joint is actually, you can see in the diagram also, there is a flattened convex ellipsoid. So this is a flattened convex ellipsoid which is paired with a concave trough, and it can allow the movement in two waves. This is one axis which is allowing flexion and extension, and there is this another movement which is allowing left to right movement. This is we can see this type of joint in our body in wrist. Radiocarpal joint is a type of ellipsoid joint where biplanar motions are possible. You can see this is flexion and extension, and this is abduction, adduction, or you can say radial and ulnar deviation. So remember, whenever there is a ellipsoid joint, biplanar motion is possible, that too flexion, extension, and abduction and adduction. Now comes ball and socket joint. We are mostly interested in studying this type of joint in very detail. We will see in glenohumeral joint, that we will study that in detail. We will see our hip joint, that too we will study in detail. The primary angular motion which is possible at a ball and socket joint is triplanar motion. There is 3 degrees of motion occurring. First we studied about hinge joint, there was 1 degree of movement. Then we studied pivot joint, there was also 1 degree of movement. Then we studied ellipsoid joint, there was 2 degrees of motion occurring. And here in ball and socket joint, there is 3 degree motion will be occurring, or triplanar motion will occur over here. And the mechanical resemblance of this ball and socket joint is spherical convex surface. So there is one surface which is convex, and it is paired with another surface that is concave. So this is a concave structure, and it is paired here with the convex one. And the anatomical example is a glenohumeral joint, a hip joint. So this was all about ball and socket. Then there is a plane joint. the motion is sliding or combined sliding or rotation which can occur. Mostly there is a sliding. Its mechanical resemblance is the book. If book is kept on table or my hand is put on the another hand, I put my hand like this on the other hand. So this is a flat surface, this is also a flat surface, and there is a joint in between them. So this type of joint we can see in the intercarpal joints, between these intercarpal bones, and also at the foot at intertarsal joints. So these are the examples of the plane joint. Then there is a saddle joint. This resembles the saddle at a horse. Whenever you will talk about saddle joint, there is a biplanar motion which is present. There is a peculiar thing about saddle joint, that it is concave in one direction and convex in another direction. As you can see in this diagram also, the direction from up and down, it is concave, and from left to right, this is convex. This is a concave surface. The same articulating surface is concave in one direction and it is convex in another direction, and these both are at right angle. These both surfaces, concave and convex, are at right angle. You can see this and this. There is a right angle present over here. And the anatomical examples of this type of joint is carpometacarpal joint and sternoclavicular joint. So these are the saddle joints in which one articulating surface is concave at one direction and convex in another direction. Now let's understand a condyloid joint. It is very similar to ball and socket joint. But here biplanar motion is possible. Here biplanar motion is possible, not a triplanar. So this is how it is different from ball and socket joint. What happens in condyloid joint is there is a convex surface which is enlarged in one dimension. You can see this is a convex ball which is very much enlarged in one direction, and it is paired with a shallow concave cup. The concave cup here is not very deep, it is very shallow, and here there is a large convex shaped surface. So here in this type of joint, flexion and extension is always present, but it can be combined with either of the two movement. First is abduction and adduction, or internal and external rotation. It can either be combined with flexion extension and abduction adduction, or flexion extension plus internal and external rotation. And the anatomical example is metacarpophalangeal joint. Here the flexion and extension is combined with abduction and adduction. And in tibiofemoral joint, which is a knee joint, here flexion and extension is combined with internal and external rotations. So I hope this is clear with you how it is different from biplanar joints, because they both look very similar to each other. This was all about the classification of the joint according to their mechanical analogy. So here first is hinge joint, which we studied, which resembles like a door. Then there is a pivot joint which resembles like a door knob. Then there is a ellipsoid joint. Then there is a ball and socket joint. It is a plane joint. It is a saddle joint. This is a condyloid joint. And this was all about the classification. But some people think that it is very complex to classify the joints in so much orders. Like you have to classify them hinge, pivot, or you can plane or ball and socket. So many of the people use very simple classification to classify this joint. They either classify them in ovoid type or saddle type. We have already read about saddle. Saddle is the surface which is convex in one direction, concave in another direction. And ovoid is a surface which is imperfectly spherical. These are the surfaces which are imperfect spheres. So some believe that it is very difficult to classify the synovial joint based on the analogy of a mechanics alone. Like the MCP joint and the GH joint have similar shape, but differ considerably in the relative magnitude of movement and overall function. I explained you how they differ in the magnitude of the movement. Ball and socket joint pursue more movement and overall mobility function is present, but at the condyloid joint the movement is restricted compared to the other joint, which is the ball and socket joint. Now ovoid joint has a paired mating surface that are imperfectly spherical or X-shaped, with adjacent parts possessing a changing surface curvature. Articular surface of one bone is convex and other is concave. it is clear one bone has to be convex and other has to be concave, but the convex bone is actually a imperfectly spherical. It is not a perfect spherical, it is imperfect spherical. And saddle joint, which we have read that they are opposite in direction, oriented at approximately 90 degrees to each other. So let's see some example of these two joints. We can see this ovoid joint in the hip radiocarpal, or in the knee joint, in the metacarpophalangeal joint, and we can see the saddle example in the thumb and in the sternoclavicular joint. So this was the classification that is also used to classify the joint. So in this video we have read about the classification of the joint. First it was based on the amount of movement, in which we classified the joints into three types. First was synarthrosis, second was amphiarthrosis, and the third was diarthrosis. Then we classified them according to their mechanical resemblance, in which we classified them into first, which was a pivot joint, then first was a hinge joint, then we classified them into pivot joint, then there was ellipsoid joint, then there was a ball and socket joint, then there was a plane joint, then there was a condyloid joint and a saddle joint. Then we classified them, we simplified the all classification and classified the joints into two types. Either they can be ovoid, which is an imperfect sphere, or it can be of saddle joint. We have seen the examples also of this joint, which is the hip joint, radiocarpal joint, knee joint, metacarpophalangeal joint, and the saddle joint examples also we have seen, which is the thumb joint and also the sternoclavicular joint. So that's it for today's video. We'll meet in the other video with another interesting topic. Thank you.